3 bedrooms and no partner, Niam. Honestly, you're wasting half this house. Dia said it the way she said all her cruelest things, lightly, like a comment about the weather, while wheeling her rolling suitcase through my front door before I had even offered to take her coat. Behind her, my brother Ewan was already making his way down the hall toward the spare room at the back, the one with the big east-facing window and the shelf where I keep my sewing things. I heard him push the door open. I heard him say, to no one in particular, "Yeah, this is the one." It was the afternoon of my housewarming. I had baked 2 loaves of bread, hung the little paper lanterns I'd been saving since last Christmas, and spent the morning trying to get the kitchen tap to stop its slow drip. I was happy. For the first time in my adult life, I was standing in a house that was mine, not rented, not shared, not borrowed, and I was happy. That lasted about 11 minutes after my family walked in. My name is Niamh Galloway. I'm 31 years old, and I work as a registered dental hygienist at a clinic near the Dartmouth waterfront. I have a small herb garden on the kitchen windowsill that I cannot keep alive no matter what I do, a collection of half-finished quilting projects stacked in the craft room, and, as of 3 months ago, a 3-bedroom house in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, that I bought entirely on my own. $418,000. 20% down, which I saved over 7 years while renting a bachelor apartment in Clayton Park and bringing my lunch to work every single day, and driving a car that I willed through 3 Nova Scotia winters with sheer determination and a block heater. I maxed my RRSP contribution room, put every spare dollar into my FHSA from the moment the account became available, and took every Saturday shift that came open at the clinic. I did it the slow way, the invisible way, the way nobody throws a party for. When I posted the listing in the family group chat, a photo of the little front garden with the peeling green gate I planned to repaint, my mother's reply came in under 2 minutes. "Wonderful news, sweetheart. Ewan and Dia are going to love having a proper base when they visit." I read that sentence 3 times. Ewan and Dia live in Toronto. They visit Halifax twice a year, sometimes 3 times, and they had been staying at hotels on the waterfront and complaining about the cost every single time. I had always understood that to be a Toronto problem, specifically, a problem belonging to 2 people with 2 incomes and a condo in Liberty Village, and not a problem with anything to do with me. I understood now that I had been wrong about that. Ewan messaged me privately 20 minutes later. Just a thumbs up and then, "We'll take the back room, more quiet." I didn't respond. I sat in the middle of my empty living room, with the afternoon light coming through the window I had chosen specifically for the way it caught the afternoon light, and I felt the familiar thing happen. The thing where something I had worked for quietly became something everyone else had opinions about. I set my phone down and went to make tea, and 2 days later a letter arrived that I did not expect. It was addressed by hand in careful, slightly slanted writing to me at my new address, which only a handful of people had yet. The postmark was Fredericton, New Brunswick. The return address was a street name I didn't recognize, and the name listed was only initials, GF. I opened it at the mailbox, standing in the October cold in my socks because I had run outside before putting my shoes on. It was short. 3 paragraphs. The person who wrote it said she didn't want anything from me. She said she had wanted to write for a long time. She said she remembered the way I used to fall asleep in her armchair when I was small, with my shoes still on. And then the last line. "Your father would have been so proud of this house." Your father. My father, Hugh Galloway, died in a single-vehicle accident on the Trans-Canada Highway when I was 7 years old. He is, in my memory, mostly a feeling, the particular weight of his hand on the top of my head, the smell of cedar from his workshop, a laugh that arrived before the joke was finished. 3 photographs and a feeling. That is what I have. I had been told, consistently and without much room for questions, that his family had blamed my mother for the accident, that his mother, my paternal grandmother, had said unforgivable things in the months after he died, and then removed herself from our lives by her own choice. And yet here was someone in Fredericton who knew my father as if they had loved him, who called him your father the way you only say it when someone is truly yours. I turned the envelope over. I read the return address again. I thought of everything my mother had told me, and then I wrote back. I kept my letter short and careful. I said only that there was a small housewarming gathering on the 22nd, and that she was welcome if she wanted to make the drive. I sealed the envelope before I could change my mind. Then I went to the craft room, the back bedroom with the big east-facing window, and I looked at the shelf where I keep my sewing things. An old wooden box, dark with age, with a tarnished brass latch and small compartments for needles and thread, and a pewter thimble worn smooth at the rim. I have had it since before I can remember. It came with me to every apartment I ever rented, every address I ever changed. I had never questioned it the way you don't question things that have simply always been yours. I ran my thumb along the edge of the latch and didn't know why my chest felt tight. I told myself I was just tired. The 22nd arrived with a thin gray sky and the smell of salt off the harbor. I had a dozen people over, colleagues from the clinic, my neighbor Gus who had helped me move in, a woman from my quilting circle, a few friends from the street. I put out cheese, a loaf of sourdough, a pot of chowder on the stove. It felt, for a few hours, like a normal and good thing. Then my family arrived. Ewan came through the door first. He's 38, broad-shouldered, the kind of person who moves through a room as though he's been invited to run it. Dia was just behind him, and she had brought a suitcase. Not an overnight bag, a rolling suitcase, the kind you check at the airport, which she wheeled through my front hallway without comment, the wheels leaving a faint gray track across my new floors. She looked around the living room, took in the paper lanterns, the chowder, my colleagues in their good coats, and then she looked at me with a small, amused expression. 3 bedrooms and no partner, Niam. Honestly, you're wasting half this house. She said it lightly, she actually smiled. My mother, who had come in behind them, had already gone down the hall. I heard the door to the craft room open. Then I heard her voice, carrying clearly over the sound of conversation. This one gets better light. We can move your little sewing things to the closet. A colleague of mine, standing near the bookshelf, caught my eye. She gave me a look that asked a question without words. I gave her a small nod that didn't answer it. I was not going to argue. I have learned over many years that arguing with the way my family moves through the world is like trying to redirect a river with your hands. You tire yourself out and the river doesn't notice. So I did something else. I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and took out a spare house key, and I walked over to Ewan and held it out to him. Here, I said, one more guest is coming. Would you mind getting the door when they knock? He took the key. He smiled at me, the easy, unearned smile of someone who has already decided how the evening will go. The knock came 40 minutes later. Ewan was the one who answered it. I watched from across the room. He opened the door and went completely still. On my front step stood an older woman, small, straight-backed, with white hair cut short and a canvas tote bag held against her chest. She looked past Ewan into the room, and when her eyes found me, something in her face opened. It was not a stranger's expression. It was the expression of someone who had been looking at a closed door for a very long time, and finally saw it swing wide. The house key dropped out of Ewan's hand and hit the hardwood floor. He turned toward my mother, who had come back from the hallway, and the words came out of him before he thought to stop them. "Mum, you said she was..." He caught himself, pressed his mouth shut, but I had heard it, and I had seen my mother's face. In that moment I understood that my mother knew exactly who this woman was. For a long moment no one moved. My guests had gone quiet the way guests go quiet when they realize they are witnessing something private and large. Then my mother crossed the room quickly, smiled brightly at the woman on my porch, and took her by the elbow. "I think there's been a mix-up," she said pleasantly. "Can I help you find where you're going?" Her hand was firm on the woman's arm, too firm. The woman did not look confused. She looked steadier than anyone else in the room. She let herself be steered half a step backward, but she kept her eyes on me, and she said, in a voice that was clear and unhurried, "My name is Greta Faulkner. I used to be Greta Galloway, before I remarried. Hugh was my son. Hugh, my father. I used to sing to you," she said. "In the apartment on Waterloo Street. You were afraid of the dark." I didn't know that street. And yet the name landed somewhere behind my sternum, with a weight that made me reach for the doorframe. My colleagues were already quietly retrieving their coats. Within 15 minutes the house had emptied of everyone who wasn't family, which is always how these scenes clear their audience. My mother steered Ewan into the kitchen. Dia followed. The door closed. I was left in my living room with an old woman and a canvas tote bag. Greta sat down slowly on my sofa. She set the bag on the coffee table between us and didn't immediately open it. "I didn't come to make trouble," she said. "I came because I'm 74 years old and I have been trying to reach you since you were 9, and I was running out of patience with trying." I asked the only question I had: "Why did you leave?" She looked at me for a long moment. "Niam," she said, "I never left. I was sent away." Then she opened the canvas bag. Inside, wrapped in a piece of flannel, were envelopes, dozens of them, bundled with elastic bands by year. "Birthday cards," she explained, "one for every birthday since I turned 9. Each one addressed to me at addresses she had pieced together over 2.5 decades through directory listings, mutual acquaintances, and one private investigator she had hired in 2011 when she was desperate enough to spend the money. Most of them had been returned. I picked one up and looked at the front. Over my name, in handwriting that was familiar in the way breathing is familiar, someone had written 3 words: "Not at address." I picked up another: "Return to sender." Another: "Return to sender." I knew that handwriting. I had seen it on birthday cards, grocery lists, and school permission forms my entire life. My mother's handwriting. I opened one from the year I would have turned 12. Inside was a card with a lighthouse on the front. Of course, a lighthouse, we were in the Maritimes, and a few lines of careful, warm words, and tucked into the fold a $20 bill, soft at the edges with age. "Happy birthday, my Niam bird," she had written. "Buy yourself something your mum doesn't pick out." That $20 had been in the envelope for 19 years. It had traveled to me and been turned away and come home to an old woman in Fredericton who had kept it because she could not bring herself to spend it on anything else. I opened the one for my 16th birthday. 16, I bet you're something. I bet nobody tells you that enough. I had to put that one down and sit very still. On the loneliest birthday I could remember, the one where the cake had the wrong name on it and nobody noticed. This woman had been trying to tell me I was something. And my mother had written 3 words on the front of the envelope and dropped it back in the mail. I want to tell you what I understood in that moment because I think it matters. Everything I had been told about being unwanted by my father's family was a lie. Not the careless lie of someone who exaggerates, or even the self-protective lie of someone who is afraid. A deliberate, repeated, 23-year lie. Someone had stood between me and a woman who loved me and sent her back, year after year, and written cold bureaucratic words across her love like a customs stamp. And I knew whose handwriting those words were in. If you have ever found out that a story you built your whole understanding of yourself around was never true, drop 1 word in the comments. I'll know what you mean. Greta stayed. I put her up at a hotel on the waterfront for the first few nights because I needed time to trust the ground under my own feet. Then I brought her to the house. She was easy company, quiet, observant, never asked me for anything. In the evenings she told me pieces of a childhood I hadn't known I'd had. She told me that when my father died, he had not left a will. He was 33 years old and he didn't think he needed one. He had bought the house in Shediac, a small place near the water, with a big backyard garden, 2 years before he married my mother. He had always talked about it as though it was the family's permanent place. The place his daughter would always have, but he never wrote that down. When a person dies without a will in New Brunswick and they are legally married, the surviving spouse inherits the bulk of the estate. My father's intention for that house didn't matter. What mattered was what was on paper. And on paper, my mother was his wife. Greta had hired a lawyer. The lawyer had told her the truth. There was nothing to be done. A surviving spouse's rights in intestacy were clear, and my mother had made it equally clear that if Greta tried to maintain contact with me, she would make sure I believed the worst of her. "She'll never come looking," my mother had apparently said. "And if she does, I'll make sure she doesn't believe a word you tell her." So Greta had done what she could. She wrote letters, she sent birthday cards, she found my address again whenever we moved, until my mother changed it to lose her. I looked up the property records for the house in Shediac myself. Sold in November of the year my father died. The same November my mother enrolled me in a new school in Halifax under a new surname, which was no longer Galloway. I had not known my name used to be different. At the very bottom of the canvas tote, under all the envelopes, folded once and held with a paper clip, I found a letter in my mother's handwriting addressed to Greta. Dated the winter after my father's death. "Do not contact this address again. My daughter has a new name and a new life, and she does not need you confusing her. If you persist, I will tell her exactly what kind of woman you are, and she will believe me. Children believe their mothers." I read it 3 times. Then I set it beside one of the returned envelopes so the 2 handwritings lay side by side on my kitchen table. The same hand, the same pen pressure, unmistakably the same person. I understood what Ewan had started to say at my front door. "Mum, you said she was gone." I called Ewan and asked him to come for Sunday dinner, and asked him not to tell my mother. He came, which tells you something about him. He is not a bad person, only a cowardly one, and somewhere under the cowardice was still a brother who remembered a sister he used to look out for. He sat at my kitchen table, and I put the letter in front of him. Then the envelopes. Then the birthday cards. One by one, he read them without speaking. He turned the card from my 12th birthday over in his hands. He looked at the $20 bill still tucked inside it. He set it down carefully. "She told me Greta had said terrible things about Mum after Dad died," he said, at last. "That she blamed her, that she was unstable, that it would be cruel to let you have any contact with someone like that. And you believed her." I was 17. "You're 38 now." He looked at the table. Outside the harbor was gray and flat. "I know," he said. I told him I needed one thing from him. The following Saturday I was having the family over for dinner, and I needed him to answer honestly when I asked him a direct question in front of everyone. Not to protect anyone, just to answer. He agreed. My mother arrived first that Saturday. She brought flowers and arranged herself at my dining room table like someone presiding over an event she had organized. Dia sat next to Ewan. My Aunt Sheila and her husband came, and 2 cousins, and a family friend who had known my father years ago. I had asked Greta to wait in the craft room until I came for her. My mother raised her glass before the food was even served. "To Niam," she said warmly, with the smile she saves for rooms she is winning, "and to having family close. This is what a home is for." I stood up. "Before we eat," I said, "I want to show everyone something." I set the canvas bag on the table. My mother's smile didn't move, but her eyes went to the bag and stayed there. I took out the envelopes and laid them on the white tablecloth one by one. My Aunt Sheila leaned forward. I turned them over so the fronts faced up, so the words returned to sender, and not at address faced up, 22 of them, spread across the tablecloth like a timeline. "My grandmother sent me one of these every birthday for 23 years, I said. "I never received a single one." My cousin picked one up, read the front, looked at my mother, set it down. "One more thing," I said. I placed the letter, My mother's letter to Greta, from the winter after my father died, on the table. I set it next to a returned envelope so the handwriting lay side by side. I let the room look. My Aunt Sheila made a quiet sound. Carol, she said. My mother's name, just that. My mother's voice, when it came, was still controlled. An old woman with a grudge could imitate anyone's handwriting. This isn't evidence of anything. Ewan, I said. My brother was looking at the tablecloth. Ewan, I said again, quietly. When did she tell you about Greta? A long pause. When I was 17, he said. And what did she tell you? He looked up at my mother, and something in his face finished deciding. That Greta had been trying to contact you, that she'd been sending letters and cards. His voice was steady, but it cost him something. That she'd been returning them, that you were settled, and Greta would only upset things. The room was very quiet. Dia was looking at her hands. My Aunt Sheila had pushed her chair back slightly from my mother's end of the table. A small movement, barely a few centimeters, and that small scrape of chair legs against the floor said everything the family had been too careful to say for 30 years. My mother stood. Her voice had gone flat and hard. I did what I thought was right. Hugh died and left us with nothing, and I built a life. I am not going to apologize for protecting my daughter from a woman who wanted to undermine everything I worked for. She picked up her bag. The flowers she had brought were still in the vase in the center of my table. She left without them. I walked to the craft room and knocked softly and opened the door. Greta was standing at the window, looking out at the backyard. She turned when I came in, and her eyes went immediately to the wooden sewing box on the shelf. The old one with the tarnished brass latch, the one that had been mine since before I could remember, the one I had carried to every apartment, every new address, for 12 years. She crossed the room and put her hand on it before she said a word. Her fingers found the brass latch without looking for it. I gave this to Hugh, she said, when he moved out the first time. It was mine before that. I kept my embroidery things in it. She looked at me. He must have had it with him when he died, and somehow, through everything, it stayed with you. I thought about the bachelor apartment in Clayton Park, the way the box had always sat on the windowsill of every place I'd lived, the way I had never questioned it, the way certain things become so much a part of you that you stop asking how they got there. It was the one thing, Greta said softly, that never got sent back. I took her hand and walked her into the dining room and introduced her to the family. The ones still sitting, the ones who had stayed to know the truth. This is Greta Faulkner, I said, my grandmother. She has been trying to find me for 23 years. I looked toward the spare room, the back bedroom with the east-facing window, the one Ewan had walked into at my housewarming, and said, in that easy, unearned voice, this is the one. That room has been waiting for someone, I said. I just didn't know who yet. And I gave her the key. Dia's rolling suitcase was still in my hallway when I went back to the front door. I wheeled it out onto the porch. What happened after is harder to summarize than the confrontation, because the confrontation has a clear shape, and what comes after is just life, which doesn't. Ewan called 2 days later. He didn't sound angry. He sounded relieved in the way people sound when they've been holding something down for a long time and are finally allowed to let it up. He said he was sorry. I told him sorry was a starting point and not a destination, and that I would need to see what he did with the distance between those two things before I knew where we stood. My Aunt Sheila called and cried and said she had always sensed something strange in the way my mother talked about my father's family, but she had never asked. I told her that was true, and I let it be true, and I didn't rush her past it. Some things belong to the person sitting with them. Greta did not go to the assisted living facility she had been looking into. She moved into the east-facing room instead. She is not a woman who takes up much space. She makes oatmeal in the mornings and leaves the kitchen tidier than she found it. She has strong opinions about the bird feeder at the back of the yard and has filled it twice already with a seed mix she picked out herself at the hardware store. She goes to bed early and reads with a lamp that casts a warm circle of light you can see from the hallway when you come home late from a long shift. Some evenings I sit with her in the craft room and we work on our separate projects, and the house is just quiet in the way a house is supposed to be quiet. Not empty quiet, full quiet. The wooden box sits on the shelf between our two sewing baskets, which feels exactly right. I have been a dental hygienist for 9 years. I spend my days up close to people in moments of small vulnerability, trying to leave them better than I found them. I have always understood that to be enough. The work, the showing up, the ordinary acts of care. What I did not understand until this year is that I deserved the same thing. Not some grand gesture. Just someone who kept showing up. Someone who kept finding my address and writing it out in careful slanted ink and sending something across the country and not stopping when it came back stamped cold. Greta drove from Fredericton to Halifax with 23 years of birthday cards in a canvas tote bag. She was 74 years old. She was not going to stop looking because some envelopes came back marked wrong. 3 bedrooms, one where I sleep, one where I work, and one that always had a name. I just needed long enough to buy the house and open the right door. I used to think an empty room was a kind of apology. Proof of something I hadn't managed to earn. I don't think that anymore. The room was always going to be for her. The house just had to wait until I could build it. If any part of this reached something in you, a family that treated what you built alone like it was already theirs, a truth someone kept from you that changed the shape of your whole story, a door you finally got to close on your own terms, tell me in the comments. I read everyone. And if you want more stories about people who stopped making themselves smaller than the space they'd earned, subscribe and stay with me. I'll leave the porch light on.